The sky tore around the B-17 like shredded parchment, clouds whipping past fragments of fuselage that had once been a protective shell. It was March 1944, 24,000 feet above the fields and forests of Nazi-occupied Europe, and Staff Sergeant Maynard "Snuffy" Smith clung to the waist gun mount as if it were the only tether between life and oblivion. The bomber's metal skin had been ripped open by German cannon fire, the roar of the engines drowned by the scream of wind rushing through gaping holes. Oxygen was nearly gone, each breath a labor against the freezing thinness of high-altitude air. Around him, the bomber formation was unraveling, planes dropping like stones under a hunter's aim. The Luftwaffe fighters circled with methodical precision, their guns trained to end the mission in seconds. In that moment, the waist gun, long dismissed as expendable and mocked in training briefings, became the last line of defense. Every instinct screamed to surrender to gravity, to let the aircraft's wreckage drag him down, yet Smith's hands tightened on the triggers. Blood, wind, and fear merged into singular focus. Survival odds were 0, and yet the gun still pointed skyward. By every rule of air combat, this fight should already be over. Before the war, Maynard "Snuffy" Smith lived a life that could have belonged to any small American town. Born into a modest working-class family, he spent his youth learning to repair engines, sharpen tools, and lift heavy loads that would have daunted most men his age. There were no accolades, no whispers of fame, no promise of command or glory. He was competent, reliable, and quietly respected only by those who worked alongside him in garages and farms. When the war arrived, Smith enlisted not for heroics, but because it was the duty expected of men like him. Assigned to the Army Air Forces, he became a waist gunner aboard the massive B-17 Flying Fortress, a position that seemed routine on paper. In training, the waist gun was taught as a theoretical line of defense. Arc calculations, controlled bursts, and angles of coverage over formation patterns. Instructors joked quietly that the position was the most vulnerable aboard the plane, a role where survival statistics were grim and fatalities expected. Smith approached it with the same diligence he had applied to engines and mechanical work, studying, practicing, and respecting every protocol, but there was no fanfare, no recognition of the skill or judgment required. He was an ordinary man in an extraordinary machine, a figure prepared for duty, but not for legend. Little did he know that the very position ridiculed for its danger and presumed expendability would demand not just skill, but the courage to defy every expectation. When Smith arrived at the U.S. Army Air Forces, he entered a world that prized machinery over men, doctrine over initiative, and chain of command over individual judgment. Instructors and officers treated the B-17 as a fortress whose strength depended on formation integrity and coordinated fire, leaving little room for improvisation. Within that hierarchy, the waist gunner was understood to be necessary, yet ultimately replaceable, a position casually referred to among crews as a fatal slot, a nod to the likelihood that those assigned there would be the first to fall in combat. The obstacles were both formal and relentless. The armor around the gun positions was minimal, offering scant protection against cannon bursts and shrapnel. Oxygen systems were limited, assuming the bomber would remain structurally intact and pressurized. Independent action was not encouraged. Gunners were expected to maintain firing discipline, cover their arcs, and do nothing that might disrupt formation protocols. Doctrine assumed the aircraft held together, that wings and fuselage would absorb punishment, and that crews would remain in a controlled environment. In reality, the Luftwaffe targeted these vulnerabilities, tearing at the bomber with precision. Institutional mockery was subtler but pervasive. Pilots were exalted for their skill and decision-making, and navigators for their precision, but not the waist gunners. As Owen's story soon discovered, the institutional mockery underestimated the power of individual resolve, the skill of resilient detail, and the exceedingly high cost of human courage in the face of overwhelming odds.
Their skill, bombardiers praised for precision, and waist gunners dismissed as expendable cogs. Yet it was within this overlooked role that Smith's ingenuity would emerge. The rules of engagement, the manuals, and the expectations all assumed compliance and survivable conditions. What the doctrine did not predict, and what the men at command never imagined, was a scenario in which those assumptions would collapse entirely, forcing one unheralded gunner to confront the impossible. By early 1944, the skies over Europe had become a deadly chessboard, where Allied daylight bombing raids met calculated resistance from a well-trained and merciless Luftwaffe. The doctrine of precision daylight bombing demanded that formations fly tight and true, exposing themselves to enemy fire in order to strike strategic industrial targets deep behind German lines. Casualty statistics were stark. Entire crews could be lost in mere minutes, bombers shredded by expertly coordinated attacks. German interceptor units were armed with 20mm cannons designed not to destroy in a single blow, but to methodically dismantle aircraft mid-flight. These pilots were disciplined, efficient, and ruthless, trained to strike at critical weak points, often from head-on angles or within close range that left little room for evasive maneuvers. Bombers did not explode in cinematic bursts. They were surgically taken apart, each wing, fuselage, and control surface rendered useless before a single parachute had a chance to deploy. For the Allies, every mission carried strategic pressure. Factories, railways, and supply depots relied on these raids, and every failure chipped away at a shrinking margin of air superiority. Survival was no longer a reasonable expectation, it was a defiance of probability. Against this backdrop, Smith's B-17 moved steadily into position, a single aircraft among many, yet already bearing the invisible weight of inevitability. As the German fighters converged on the formation, the focus tightened, and the moment for an ordinary man to confront extraordinary circumstances was about to arrive. The waist gunner's role aboard a B-17 was deceptively simple in training, but unforgiving in practice. The .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun was mounted on a flexible ring, allowing a full 180-degree horizontal arc and limited vertical motion. In a functioning aircraft, gunners learned to compensate for engine vibration, recoil, and the sway of a 30-ton bomber in formation, adjusting aim in response to turbulence and the subtle pitching of the plane. Targets were fleeting. Each burst of fire demanded precision, timing, and coordination with fellow gunners. Recoil pushed against the mount, and the gunner had to brace with both body and shoulder to prevent destabilization. Wind, normally filtered through fuselage walls, became a constant whipping adversary when exposed. Every calculated motion was designed for a controlled environment. Smith's situation, however, violated every assumption. The aircraft was structurally compromised, the fuselage ripped open, and the familiar patterns of airflow replaced by chaotic gusts through jagged metal. Doctrine offered no guidance. No manuals taught firing while partially in freefall, while oxygen deprived, while the floor beneath one's feet had vanished. In these conditions, recoil could send a man spinning, and a single misstep meant being ejected into the void. Yet Smith improvised procedurally rather than mechanically. He braced against the torn aluminum with knees and forearms, adjusted the gun's elevation with micro-corrections, and timed bursts to maintain control of his own body and the weapon. In effect, he transformed the collapsing bomber into a mobile firing platform, a feat as if one were firing from a moving truck whose chassis was simultaneously disintegrating underfoot. Each pull of the trigger demanded both physical and mental calibration, a combination of reflex, experience, and situational awareness that no training could replicate. This was not luck or coincidence.
The enemy, trained to identify predictable patterns, faced a gunner whose firing arcs were irregular but effective, whose persistence defied expectation. Smith maintained a lethal presence in the air long after the aircraft had ceased functioning as a cohesive machine. It was this extraordinary improvisation, this combination of skill, ingenuity, and sheer will that set the stage for the first measurable impact, the moment when the impossible began to take tangible form. As the first German fighters swept in, the surviving crew of Smith's B-17 braced for the inevitable. From their vantage points, the ripped fuselage and howling wind suggested that the waist gunner's position had become meaningless, that the machine and its operator were doomed. Moments later, the impossible happened. A burst of .50 caliber fire erupted from the exposed waist mount, sending tracer rounds streaking through the sky. Muzzle flashes illuminated the jagged metal edges, signaling that Smith was not only still alive, but actively defending the aircraft. For a heartbeat, disbelief froze the eyes of both allies and enemies. The German fighters, trained to anticipate static and predictable arcs, encountered an erratic, relentless gunner whose bursts were precise yet unpredictable. Their tight formation wavered, one plane edging away to avoid the unanticipated fire, another opening a wider arc to compensate. The pressure on the remaining B-17s, though far from eliminated, softened, and a brief reprieve allowed crews to regroup within the battered formation. This was not yet triumph, nor a claim of victory, but it was undeniable proof. The rules of the sky had been defied, and the mocked waist gunner remained a threat. By the time the first wave withdrew, hesitant and cautious, it was clear that Smith had survived the initial test, and the impossible had begun to manifest in concrete, measurable effect. The German fighters regrouped swiftly, circling back with renewed precision. They had assessed the unexpected resistance and adjusted their tactics, coordinating head-on approaches and slashing passes to exploit every weakness in the bomber's torn fuselage. Within the waist section, Smith's situation grew perilous by the second. Blood, a mix of minor cuts and abrasions from jagged metal, streaked his uniform, seeping through gloves and sleeves. The freezing high-altitude air numbed fingers and face alike, turning every movement into a battle against sensation. The aircraft continued to twist and tear under repeated cannon fire. Panels rattled and fell away, leaving Smith partially suspended in a wind tunnel that threatened to sweep him into the void with each lurch. Yet he adapted. He shifted his body weight subtly, pressing forearms and knees against the jagged aluminum, adjusting to the changing angles of attack. Each burst of fire was timed to counteract both recoil and the violent sway of the plane, a combination of reflexive muscle memory and sharp situational assessment. He anticipated enemy maneuvers, pivoting the gun to cover emerging threats and exploiting gaps in their approach. Every passing second elevated the stakes. Survival was no longer a passive hope, but a dynamic, responsive calculation. His focus narrowed, excluding fear and pain, concentrating only on the immediate threats and the mechanics of each controlled burst. For those observing, it appeared almost superhuman, an unbroken rhythm amidst chaos, evidence that skill and presence of mind could prevail even under extreme conditions. As tracer rounds continued to flare in the torn fuselage, the Luftwaffe prepared for the final attack run. The B-17 shuddered with each pass, the shredded metal groaning under the assault. Smith steadied himself, aware that the coming strike would test not only his endurance, but the limits of what any man could achieve under fire. At 24,000 feet, the B-17 hung in pieces, its fuselage split and torn asunder, a shadow of its former integrity. For over 60 critical seconds, Smith maintained disciplined fire from the exposed waist gun, adjusting each burst to counter the violent sway of the crippled aircraft. Tracers lanced through the thin, frigid air, forcing German fighters to break formation and widen their attack angles. The precision and relentlessness of his defense created confusion and hesitation among the Luftwaffe pilots, who had expected an easy kill. One by one, the attackers disengaged entirely, retreating from the crippled bomber that should have been defenseless. In this brief, measured interval, the rules of aerial warfare were rewritten. A single enlisted gunner, armed with skill and focus, had imposed a tangible outcome against a superior enemy. Doctrine assumed a functioning aircraft and coordinated defense. Smith proved that human ingenuity and courage could succeed where theory predicted failure. When Smith finally touched the ground, battered, exhausted, and shivering, the reality of survival felt almost surreal. Rescue crews, arriving amidst scattered wreckage, found him alive, gripping the waist gun mount as if it had been an extension of his own body. Reports of his actions spread quickly through the squadron, met at first with disbelief. Officers questioned the plausibility, skeptical that any man could continue firing from a disintegrating bomber at 24,000 feet. Witness statements accumulated, each account corroborating the extraordinary persistence and accuracy of Smith's defensive fire. Physical evidence, the battered gun, jagged fuselage panels, and documented enemy disengagement left little room for doubt. Slowly, the mockery that had once defined his position faded into silence. That silence, in turn, transformed into respect, as peers and superiors alike recognized that a routine, overlooked role had been elevated by courage and skill into a decisive factor in survival. It was a shift, both immediate and profound. What had been assumed impossible had occurred, forcing even hardened officers to reconsider assumptions about human endurance and the underestimated roles within the bomber's crew. This was not meant to happen, and yet, against all odds, it had. After the harrowing mission, Smith's survival and valor became the subject of formal recognition. Though enlisted gunners rarely received the nation's highest honors, his actions earned him the Medal of Honor, a rare acknowledgment of extraordinary courage in a role often considered expendable. Official citations meticulously recorded his precise contributions, from sustained fire to enemy disengagement, preserving the account for military history, as even popular memory largely overlooked it. Doctrine did not dramatically shift overnight. Bomber strategy continued to prioritize formation integrity and coordinated defense. Yet subtle changes emerged. Training manuals began to note the importance of improvisation under duress, and instructors occasionally referenced Smith's example when emphasizing vigilance and adaptability among gunners. His story survived primarily in squadron records, award citations, and the recollections of those who witnessed his feat firsthand, a reminder that history often treasures the extraordinary in quiet margins rather than public acclaim. Today, the B-17 Flying Fortress occupies a place of reverence in museums across the United States and Europe, preserved as a symbol of industrial ingenuity, strategic might, and the men who operated them. The waist gunner's position, once derided as a fatal slot, now stands as a testament to the courage and resourcefulness that transformed ordinary soldiers into legends. In that frozen, perilous moment high above Europe, Smith proved that even the most overlooked roles could leave a lasting imprint on history, echoing far beyond the fleeting chaos of battle. In the end, Smith's story is a testament to ingenuity over dogma, to the power of the individual against the expectations of an institution. A waist gunner, mocked and dismissed, became the pivot of survival, proving that courage, skill, and presence of mind can triumph even when every rule says it cannot. That frozen moment, 24,000 feet above Europe, was not just a test of metal and ordnance. It was a measure of human resolve, a quiet defiance that turned fear into action and vulnerability into impact. These are the stories that remind us why history matters. The forgotten feats, the uncelebrated heroes, and the moments that challenge our assumptions. If you want to help rescue more stories like this, like the video, subscribe to join the mission, and share in the comments your country, your family, or anyone whose courage deserves recognition. The past is alive in memory, and together we can ensure it is never forgotten.